Something strange is happening in the American motorcycle market, and it's subtle enough that most people haven't even noticed it yet. There are all these small motorcycles being sold now, and I mean very small, sitting below the 300cc threshold, which typically serves as the bare minimum people expect from a modern entry-level machine. These bikes are so small, they have almost no real reason to exist in the United States. They're motorcycles that make perfect sense in India, Vietnam, or parts of South America, but they feel oddly misplaced when dropped into the American landscape. These bikes are not fast, they're not flashy, they're not aspirational, they don't even pretend to be exciting. And yet, here they are, sitting on showroom floors next to Ninja 500s and MT-07s like they belong. This begs the question, why now? Why are manufacturers suddenly peddling motorcycles that would have been laughed out of US dealerships just 10 years ago? Are these bikes meant to be an ultra cheap gateway drug? A low friction on-ramp to motorcycling for younger riders who are completely priced out of the hobby? Or are they the product of something more cynical? OEMs identifying a permanently cash-strapped demographic and saying, this is all you're ever going to afford, so get it while you can. We're calling this category beginner light, and today we're going to unpack what it says about motorcycling and the direction the sport might be heading in. Before we dive too deep into the nitty-gritty, we need to establish context and clearly define what bikes we're talking about. The beginner light category lives below what we traditionally consider a modern US starter bike. These are low cc, low power, low spec motorcycles that prioritize cost, simplicity, and durability over performance, tech, or progression. So some examples include the KTM Duke 250, the Kawasaki KLX 230, and the W230, and the Honda XR150L. And even Royal Enfield's 350 lineup, where despite being over 300 cc's, they offer much less power or feature due to their simple low spec design. It's also been reported that Kawasaki is bringing back the Ninja 300 to live beneath the Ninja 500 as an even more affordable and even more accessible alternative. One could call it beginner light. A strategy similar to what CF Moto does, selling their 300SS for bottom dollar prices, even though the 450SS is a superior purchase in almost every single way. All these motorcycles I've mentioned are not bad bikes. They're just extremely basic. Super modest power, basic suspension, minimal electronics, sometimes even air-cooled, frequently built on platforms that have existed overseas for a decade or sometimes several decades. Now, contrast that to motorcycles that we define here in North America as a normal beginner bike. You've got stuff like the Ninja 500, the Duke 390, or Honda's CRF 300L. The road-going beginner bike typically makes about 40 horsepower these days, and even the CRF, which is not exactly a powerful bike, has the stance and poise of a real full-sized machine. A modern beginner bike can keep up in traffic, survive the highway, and offer enough performance to keep you having fun and excited about riding. They're friendly for beginners, but don't feel overly disposable or compromised. The beginner light category, by comparison, feels intentionally limited, which makes their presence really weird in the United States. Beginners in the US don't need less power than they did 10 years ago. If anything, the traffic and road conditions make these super low powered bikes more dangerous. So why are we seeing more and more of these bikes quietly being ushered into dealerships when we know they'll struggle to exist in much of the environment? In many parts of the world, motorcycles aren't toys. They're infrastructure. In countries like India and Vietnam, motorcycles are the primary mode of transportation for a huge portion of the population. We're talking tens of millions of daily riders moving together in dense urban environments across narrow streets at modest speeds. You've probably seen them carrying their family, their cousin, their goat, their groceries, all in the back of a 125. These small displacement bikes used in these countries reflect the needs of the culture. Beyond being physically suited for the environment, they're also economically suited as well, as cost is a major factor in many parts of the world. In these markets, a motorcycle isn't about passion or performance, it's just about survival. It has to be cheap to buy, cheap to run, easy to fix, and robust enough to survive abuse. That's why small displacement bikes dominate. They just make economic sense. Now, compare that to the US. American motorcycling is overwhelmingly recreational. We just use our bikes for fun. It's a hobby for middle and upper income riders. The roads are big and fast moving. It's hard to avoid freeways where 80 miles an hour is the norm. Motorcycles share the road with lifted pickup trucks, semis, and SUVs the size of studio apartments. Dense urban areas, the types of environments where a beginner light motorcycle would theoretically thrive, make up a pretty small portion of the country's geographical footprint. And in those cities, motorcycles compete with public transit, bicycles, scooters, rideshare apps, and e-bikes, which is a huge growing segment of the mobility market. Motorcycles aren't really the obvious solution, which kind of leads the other critical question. If the baseline for a usable motorcycle in America is about 40 horsepower, what problem is the beginner light motorcycle really solving? Bikes like the W230, Duke 250, XR150L, they are just small. They're bordering on being unusable for our environments. They're not faster than traffic. They don't offer acceleration that can create safe distances or allow you an exit path. They're not offering real usefulness that a normal sized beginner bike doesn't. So what's their purpose? Beginner bikes used to be more attainable. There was a time when buying a brand new entry-level motorcycle was a reasonable decision for someone who was in their early 20s, who was new in their career. Hey, that was me when I started riding. But that era is kind of gone. Also, the era of having a career seems to be gone. The gig economy has taken its toll and jobs are not secure anymore. I digress, that's not today's topic. Today, the Ninja 500 hovers around $6,000 depending on the trim level before any taxes or fees or gear or licensing. You get what I'm saying. The Duke 390 lands roughly in the same territory. A KLX 300 is knocking on the door of $6,000. I mean, $6,000 for a little single-cylinder dirt bike thing? Really? Once you factor in dealer fees, freight, setup, taxes, registration, that entry-level bike is looking like $7,000 or $8,000 out the door. That's not really entry level for many people. And look, manufacturers aren't going to reverse MSRP creep. Prices go up every year. If there's one thing you can be certain of, is that prices go up. They never go down. Every generation gets marginal updates and a 5 to 10% increase to the price. Then contrast that to the purchasing power of Americans. Wages have stagnated relative to housing, education, healthcare, student loan debt, and basic cost of living. Disposable income that allows you to drop $8,000 on a hobby is increasingly rare for young people. In the early 90s, the average 27-year-old with a decent job could realistically afford a modest house, a reliable car, and still have some money left over for toys. A leader bike wasn't some insane financial flex. I know you Instagram clout goblins are having a hard time wrapping your mind around that. But plenty of riders skip the beginner rider stage entirely because they could afford to. Fast forward to today, and that same age group is spending half of their incomes just on rent alone, and the remainder on student loans and high-interest car payments, which they need to get around because you need a car in America. How are you going to get around without a car around here? Saving thousands of dollars for a motorcycle could take years. And when the barrier to entry gets that high, people aren't just going to save harder, they'll just opt out. And this is where the beginner light category starts to make sense and also start to feel unsettling. These bikes are not segmented by power, technology, or riding style. They're almost exclusively segmented by price. The goal isn't to build the optimized beginner bike. The goal is to land below a mental threshold, usually a magic sub $5,000 price point. Once a bike dips below that line, it enters an entirely different psychological conversation. This isn't a new idea. We've seen this happen in cars. Nissan famously applied this strategy to the Versa. While the rest of the automotive industry chased bloated crossovers and pricing that bordered on premium, Nissan deliberately built a bare-bones, bottom-dollar commuter car. It wasn't aspirational, it certainly wasn't exciting. It was designed to exist because a massive chunk of the population just couldn't afford anything else. Now that same logic is creeping into motorcycles. CF Moto has already proven this strategy out. You undercut the Japanese brands, pack in a lot of features, and play a high-volume game while accepting thinner margins and checks from the CCP. But the beginner-like category takes this one step further. Reduce the specs, reuse global platforms, simplify manufacturing, and hit a number that feels accessible, even if the bikes themselves are not providing more value by comparison. But for some reason, because our monkey brains are trained this way, $4,700 feels radically different from $6,800, even if you get way more motorcycle at the latter price point. This is where my mind went when we caught wind that Kawasaki intends on bringing back the Ninja 300 to live on their offering list below the Ninja 500. Last time the Kawasaki Ninja 300 existed, Kawi said, "This isn't enough, we gotta keep updating it. Bigger engine, more power, more features," and it grew and morphed into the Ninja 400, and now the 500. But now Kawasaki's thinking, man, we made our entry-level bike too expensive. Let's bring back an outdated, smaller version into the markets and hit that budget-conscious demographic again. It's almost like Suzuki, I cannot even believe I'm saying this, once again, maybe failing upwards with their GSX 250R. I mean, really? But if these ultra-small, outdated, but affordable bikes become standard, if every manufacturer has a beginner-like offering, Suzuki may be ahead of the curve with their 20-year-old outdated beginner bike platform, which is actually hilarious. Even if we acknowledge manufacturers are building bikes solely to meet a certain price threshold, it still presents another question. Are they responding to a temporary affordability gap, or are they quietly admitting that a large portion of the population will never again be able to afford real motorcycles?
If you've ever tried filming your own rides while out on the bike, you know it can be a pain. Switching mounting points, swapping batteries, juggling 5 different cameras and microphones just to get one good shot. But with the new DJI Osmo 360, that chaos is over. This thing is your one camera solution for motorcycle content. Helmet shots, handlebar shots, full 360 panoramas, it does it all, instantly. In panoramic mode, you can shoot gorgeous 8K at 50 frames per second or drop to 6K 60 for buttery smooth action. Do you need slow-mo? I'll do 4K at 100 FPS. You can even snap full 120 megapixel 360 shots, or flip into single lens mode and run it like a normal action camera with 4K 120 ultra wide boost mode with a crazy 170 degree field of view, or 5K 60 for cinematic flat video. The best part? You can switch between the front and rear lenses on the fly without ever stopping the recording. It's like having 2 cameras in one. No retakes, no fiddling with mounts, and because it's part of DJI's ecosystem, it plays perfectly with the Mic Mini and all of your other DJI gear and accessories. Everything just works really intuitively together. So whether you're filming your morning commute or a full-blown track day, the Osmo 360 keeps it simple, seamless, and seriously professional. Hit the link in the description to grab yours and simplify your whole setup with the DJI Osmo 360.
There's a version of this story that isn't entirely dystopian. Imagine a 22-year-old with an entry-level job earning a modest income. They see motorcycles on Instagram and YouTube and they think, man, I want that in my life. But every time they price it out, reality just hits hard. A brand new Ninja 500 could cost $8,000 out the door. That's just for the bike. There are used bikes, but all the ones in the area are clapped, overpriced, or sold by sketchy weirdos on Marketplace. Plus, insurance is pretty brutal for a young guy. Maintenance is intimidating to do on your own and costly at the dealership, and suddenly that dream starts to feel like a bad financial decision rather than an exciting life choice. So they wait. They'll say, I'll take the leap in a year, and then that year becomes 5, and then 10, and then they have kids, and then they get married, and then it's just never, right? Because once they arrive at a point where they can comfortably afford to ride, they've long lost that spark. That je ne sais quoi, that joie de vivre that comes with being young that makes you want to jump on a motorcycle. The beginner light category interrupts that spiral. It offers a low friction entry point, something brand new, reliable, and backed by a warranty, something that doesn't require gambling on a marketplace deal that is too good to be true, a $2,500 CF Moto, if you will. It serves as a way to start riding now, not someday in the theoretical future. And maybe that's enough to justify the existence of this category. Maybe these tiny bikes exist to get people engaged sooner rather than later, to ensure that when they do reach a point of financial stability, they're already motorcyclists. They're hooked and emotionally invested in riding as a core part of their identity. In that interpretation, the beginner light bikes aren't exploitative, but they're a jumping off point. They're a placeholder that says, we know you can't afford much right now, but we don't want to lose you entirely. That version of the story is compelling, but it's not the only possible explanation. Let's challenge the notion that the beginner light category will serve as a gateway drug, because that assumes something very generous, that every rider eventually graduates. But what if that's not the plan? What if manufacturers aren't betting on upward mobility at all? What if they're looking at the American economy, at wage data, cost of living, and concluding that a massive portion of our American populace is never going to reach a level of financial comfort where even a $7,000 motorcycle makes sense? Yes, I know that's pretty black-pilled, but hear me out. Because if you accept that premise, this category stops looking like a stepping stone and starts looking like a final destination. I mean, it's kind of like all those apartments you see popping up everywhere, right? You're just meant to live there. You're not meant to ever go anywhere else. In developing countries, these bikes are not beginner bikes. They're the bike. You don't upgrade because there really isn't anywhere to upgrade to. And that's the unsettling parallel. As the US economy becomes increasingly K-shaped, it's not hard to imagine OEMs identifying a permanent underclass of buyers. People who will always want two wheels, will always be aware of the culture, but who will never have the liquidity for what we traditionally consider a proper motorcycle. So, what do? You can't abandon a whole demographic of potential customers. That's just bad for business. You can't down-spec the existing products and risk alienating your more affluent customers, so instead, you import or revive old platforms designed for poverty-level purchasing power and sell them domestically, all wrapped up with a friendly badge and a carefully framed narrative. You don't say to the customer, this is all you'll ever afford, buddy. You say, oh, this is simple, approachable, and authentic. It kind of reminds me of tiny homes, where we've convinced a generation of people that living in a shed with a mini split is as good as owning a home because it's efficient and small and cheap. Yeah, you live in a shed. Your parents had a house. Suddenly, the beginner light category stops representing a gateway and starts representing containment. Look at American cities with certain areas with high poverty rates. You see teens and young adults riding Coleman mini bikes, Chinese pit bikes, or some knockoff e-bike. There is interest in motorcycling. People love having fun on two wheels, but there's no bridge to a $7,000 motorcycle. So manufacturers think, well, this 230cc engine we've got floating around here in India, that works great in a dense country with a large, low-earning population. Certainly we can offer a similar thing here. Yeah, it's kind of a black pill take, like I said, but it could be interpreted that beginner light motorcycles are sold in the US because manufacturers have accepted that large segments of this population will never financially advance. Sort of an uncomfortable thought, but not entirely irrational. Are we turning into a third world country? You let me know in the comments down below. Okay, hear me out. Before we spiral completely, there is a more moderate interpretation. Not everything is nefarious or conspiratorial. Sometimes a cheap bike is just a cheap bike, and there are some legitimate use cases for small, simple bikes in the US. There are places where they can exist on the fringes. Rural riders who want something indestructible for the farm and back gravel roads, the TW200 has filled this niche for decades. Or you could think of urban mobility. While there are many other options in big cities that most people will arrive at first, some of these bikes could serve as someone who wants something a little more motorcycle-like than a scooter, but bigger and less goofy than a Grom. Kind of finding this laser tight margins for the market here, but something street legal that they can ride without constantly looking over their shoulder like you would on a Sur-Ron. A beginner light motorcycle could potentially fill the gap that's currently occupied by modified e-bikes or jailbroken scooters that exist in a legal gray area for now. It would be taking an existing niche and sort of legitimizing it. And maybe that's all it is. Maybe manufacturers saw demand forming in the cracks within the categories and decided to fill it. No black-pilled conspiracy or dystopian feudalism, or maybe it's a combination of all of it. This new beginner-light category is unsettling because of what it represents. It forces us to confront a reality motorcycling has largely avoided. That affordability is becoming the defining constraint of this hobby. We've been talking about it for years on this channel, and even entry-level machines aren't quite entry-level enough. Whether these bikes are a stepping stone into riding, a way to earn the patronage of priced-out buyers, or just pragmatic tools for low-cost utility, their presence signals that something has fundamentally changed in the world of motorcycling, at least here in America. Thanks for watching all the way to the video. I'll catch you in the next one.